Recording has been started.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Adityanjee, and I am President of the Council for Strategic Affairs. Today is Saturday, April 22nd, 10 a.m. Eastern Day Time, and we are here for our monthly Distinguished Lecture Series of the CSA, and the honorable guest who is going to deliver the distinguished lecture is Dr. Bharat Karnad, and he will be speaking on India's nuclear doctrine, need for change. Before we start, a little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. CSA imparts education in the field of international relations. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. The Council encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. The Council condemns terrorism in all forms worldwide, and CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. And as you see at the bottom of this slide, that is our URL, our website's address, www.councilforstrategicaffairs.org. We do a monthly roundtable discussion that is held on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Day Time. There's a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on fourth Saturday of each month that we are having today. We also organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publications of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And finally, we have a summer internship program for college students. So as you will probably see, this is Dr. Bharat Karnad. He runs his own blog site called Security Wise. And if you go on his blog site as well as our announcement, he has given a little bit of details about his philosophy about India's nuclear doctrine and India's nuclear policy. I'm not going to read everything because I would let him speak about his views about India's nuclear policy, except for saying that in hardcore terms, he's a nuclear policy hawk for India for last 3.5 decades. And I am very amazed and I'm very, very impressed that there has not been any ideological waver on his part, come what may. He has held his views. Governments have come and governments have gone. Most of the establishment has not agreed with his hawkish policies, but he has kept his convictions on, which is reflected in his writings, his books, and his media interviews and articles. So who is Bharat Karnad? Bharat Karnad is the Distinguished Fellow of the United Service Institution of India and Emeritus Professor of National Security Studies at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. His most recent book was Staggering Forwards, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition. It was published in 2018. Previous books have included Why India is Not a Great Power Yet from Oxford University Press, Strategic Sellout, India-US Nuclear Deal, India's Nuclear Policy, published by Prager, Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security, The Realist Foundations of Strategy, now in second edition, published by Macmillan, and Future Imperiled, India's Security in 1990s and Beyond, that was published in 1994. He was member of the First National Security Advisory Board, member of the Nuclear Doctrine Drafting Group, National Security Council of the Government of India, and formerly advisor on defense expenditure to the Finance Commission of India. He was educated at University of California in Los Angeles, where he has been visiting scholar, also at Princeton University, UPenn, and University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He is a foreign fellow at Shanghai Institute of International Studies and Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. He lectures at top military training and discussion forums, including CORE, which is Combined Operational Review and Evaluation, DRDO Annual Directors Conference, National Defense College, High Command courses at Army War College, College of Air Force Warfare, College of Naval Warfare, College of Defense Management, College of Military Engineering, and at Army Command and Corps level fora and equivalent in other two armed services. He has been a teacher and lectures at Defense Services Staff College and also at IAS, Indian Administrative Service Academy, Foreign Service Institute, and National Police Academy. So before I hand over the platform to Professor Bharat Karnad, a few of housekeeping rules. I would request all of you to keep yourself on mute to avoid noise interference. Also, please change your cell phone to vibration mode. When Professor Karnad is speaking, I don't want anyone to interrupt him. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to pose questions at the end of the talk. We do not allow anonymous questioners. All questions are moderated and have to be submitted to the chat function. We want questions to be very specific and precise. We don't want a monologue or detailed commentary in the form or garb of a question. If there is a monologue or a lecture in the chat function, I will ignore it. Lastly, like all our programs, this program is also being recorded and it will be available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel within next 24 hours. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to present to you Professor Bharat Karnad. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm very honored to have been invited to deliver this lecture. And I look forward to the interaction at the end of it. I have about 45 minutes, I believe, to give a talk and then for us to go into the interaction session. Very simply, the professed formal doctrine that the Indian government gazetted, which is what the term is for making it official, was on January 3rd, 2004. And that talked of massive retaliation. It was built around the concept of massive retaliation, and it departed quite radically from the draft doctrine that was presented to the government at the time, which was the first BJP government under the second BJP government, under Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So we'll discuss some of these aspects, the disjunction between the draft doctrine and the professed doctrine of the government of India, and also what needs to be done by way of rectifying it and making it more relevant for the future. The drafting group, just to get you inside what happened at the time, most of the people there, actually, it was some 27 odd members, but they were on a listening brief because very few of them really knew about nuclear matters. They were on a listening brief. So there were 2 or 3 of us who actually were involved because we had our academic training, etc. in it. And so we could contribute. And of course, the drafting group was led by the late K. Subramaniam, ex-IAS and so on, and ex-Defense Production Secretary. Now, we were hampered at the time by what the Prime Minister had in his suo motu statement of 28 May 1998, proclaimed and declared to the parliament, which is, he said, that the Indian deterrent would be minimum, and it would hew, the deterrence concept would hew to the no first use. These were the two terms of reference, as it were, spelled out by the Prime Minister. So naturally, that those were the parameters within which we had to draft the doctrine. In the event, what we came up with was the draft doctrine, which you can access on the MEA website, but sufficient to say that it talked about sufficient, effective, and survivable deterrent. And it also talked about being these nuclear forces that the country builds up, being able to endure repetitive, attritive attacks. In other words, the very notion of minimum gets enlarged right away. And that is the basic, shall we say, thrust of the draft doctrine, that we build in elasticity. And people don't realize that a doctrine by nature, by its very nature, is more of a guideline. It's not a strategy. It's a guideline. And so it's often thought of synonymously as strategy and tactics and so on. It's not. It's merely a guideline which the government can use, or the Nuclear Forces Command can use, to shape its nuclear tactical doctrines and so on. Now, the point to make is that the draft doctrine talked about a credible minimum deterrence. So to the minimum deterrence that the Prime Minister had already spelled out in Parliament, we added the word credible. And it was crucial, because what we ended up, as I said earlier, injecting into the doctrine was a lot of elasticity for future governments to consider the situations that they faced, and if necessary, to build up or build down should the world disarm, etc. So we had built in the flexibility into the doctrine. And this is unique in a sense. India is unique in a sense that it's the only government that made public the draft doctrine for public debate. It's never happened in any other country in the world. Some of us objected at the time, and in a sense, we alerted the government to the fact that now that you have made it public, you can expect an awful lot of pressure to define what the minimum is and what credible is, which wouldn't have happened had the entire draft doctrine, been kept secret. That didn't happen. So enormous pressure has been, the government has been under enormous pressure from the very start to, in a sense, define minimum and in some way to justify whatever it is that the government of India had in mind to do by way of nuclear deterrence. The government then, when I talked about the massive retaliation concept, if you recall what I said at the very beginning, the government in its wisdom then departed some more from the credible minimum deterrence notion that we had encapsulated in the doctrine into a massive retaliation doctrine, which was, for many of us, we would certainly, I would consider it completely ill-advised, primarily because massive retaliation by its very notion is impracticable. And the major countries of the world discarded it very early on in their nuclear evolution. And this is unfortunately what the government did not wait to do. Massive retaliation is inherently, as I said, credible, meaning it does not pack credibility, because the other, shall we say, the triggers that the government talked about was not just a nuclear attack for India to respond in a punitive manner, but also to chemical and biological weapons attack, which complicates things because a little before we sat down to drafting the doctrine, if many of you might recall, there was an attack of plague in Surat, in Gujarat, in 1992. And that again, to many of us, had the parameters of a biological weapon attack. Why? Because the strain of plague was unique. It was never been seen before or been so classified within the subcontinent. It was very targeted, localized, and it disappeared as quickly as it had struck. It's a perfect definition of biological weapon attack. Now, this is the thing that, at least I remember at the time when we were drafting the doctrine, I said that we should not use it as a trigger, because what would you end up doing? Assuming you believe your doctrine of massive retaliation, which was also discussed and discarded at the drafting stage, what would we have to do? You would have to respond what? By bombing whomever we suspected as unleashing this biological weapon attack? Because there's no absolutely no plausible way to prove that one or the other country had actually launched such an attack. And so I posed the question at the time. I remember, what would you do? Would you have bombed Karachi with a nuclear bomb? I mean, see the absurdity of it. This is to point out the absurdity of massive retaliation, which the major countries very early realized and then rectified. During the John F. Kennedy years and thereon, it was flexible response, which, by the way, I must say, is really the operational doctrine of the Strategic Forces Command of India. Massive retaliation is just a doctrine for rhetorical purposes, which really doesn't serve any even that particular purpose. But the thing is, in actual practical terms, I'd imagine that the Strategic Forces Command would act in a flexible way. They'd see what the provocation is. They'll see what assuming we suffer a first strike, and how to respond, the size and scale of it, etc. So this is where matters actually stand. The government has, after the January 3, 2004 gazetting, there's been no news thereafter from the government of India. And which is where, and because one is aware that massive retaliation is by its very notion inherently absurd, therefore, in practical terms, I would speculate that the Strategic Forces Command are therefore onto a flexible doctrine, a proportional punitive response doctrine. That said, look at what has happened by way of the credibility of nuclear weapons. In the post-Ukraine conflict, is not post, ongoing Ukraine conflict situation. The earlier Soviet Union, earlier, by the way, United States, had talked about a massive retaliation because the Soviets had conventional military superiority, which the West and NATO could not match. Therefore, they said, well, if these Soviet forces are going to intrude through the Fulda Gap in Central Europe, that we'd go massive retaliation, and that was the way to deter. Now, over the time, of course, as Russians and the Soviets increased the inventory, the massive retaliation became, not very credible, and they changed to a responsive kind of a doctrine which was responsible to the unfolding situation, which is where most major countries stand, which is where I believe India too stands. Now, given the fact that in Ukraine, President Putin has for the first time reversed the role in saying that because NATO is helping Ukraine with conventional weapon supply and rearmament, etc., that it feels, it will feel free should things turn markedly against Russia for Putin to then declare and then use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. This brings us to the Indian weapons, kind of what is the quality notions. In the NATO Warsaw Pact kind of context, a tactical weapon is anything up to 10 to 20 kiloton. Now, incredibly, the only proven weapon in the Indian arsenal is at 20 kiloton. the thermonuclear weapon that was tested in 1998, the so-called S1 test on May 11, 1998, was a fizzle. It did not work. A fizzle, by the way, is not a literary allusion. A fizzle is a technical term for the explosion that that has yield of only up to 7 to 20% of the planned yield, meaning that what we tested by way of some say it was a boosted fission, not a true two-stage, it does not matter. The point is it was thermonuclear in its intent, and that fizzled, it didn't work. The first thing when a country is, shall we say, confronted with a failed test is to test again and again in an iterative fashion, in an open ended way, to get everything right, the design right. Because, and I quote Richard Garvin, who was the premier American thermonuclear weapon designer in the 50s, the Adam Ulam Teller configuration was actually made practical by Richard Garvin when he weaponized the device. And he said that 2,000 things have to go right for the thermonuclear weapon to explode in the correct way, for it to provide the yield that was planned. 2,000. And we had a fizzle which produced less than, by the government's own acknowledgement, 53 kiloton. A boosted fission, a thermonuclear device with 53 kiloton. Manifestly, there was something that had gone awry. And therefore, the point obviously is that we need to test again. The country needs to test again, which is what I've been saying in a very sustained fashion ever since the 1998 test, while I was still on the board, the National Security Advisory Board, and thereafter, that we need to test again, etc. But again, the government of the day at the time did not agree. They announced a voluntary moratorium on testing. That is, Atal Bihari Vajpayee announced a voluntary moratorium on testing on the very day that he was making the suo motu statement to Parliament on May 28, 1998. This, despite the field director of Pokhran test site at in Rajasthan, Dr. Santhanam, reporting to the government, reporting officially, formally to the government, that the thermonuclear device test had failed. The government of India had that information before it. Even so, the Prime Minister went ahead and declared a voluntary moratorium. Now consider what the voluntary moratorium did. It became the basic baseline for us to stick to it, for the United States then to declare that any civilian nuclear cooperation would be on the basis that we never test again. Now that never made sense to me. If there's a friendly country, so all I could conclude was that the US therefore had its non-proliferation objectives paramount, and it was willing therefore to cast aside every other consideration, including the fact, as I've always asked my American interlocutors that I've dealt with in Washington and elsewhere, I said, would it not help the American cause, the Western cause, for India to have a proven high-yield thermonuclear weapon to match China's, whose standard issue strategic force weapon is a 3.3 megaton weapon. Now, put the 20 kiloton weapon, proven weapon, Indian weapon, alongside the 3.3 megaton, and you have an instant self-deterrent deterrence notion that kicks in where India is concerned. For obvious reasons, China is never going to, with this kind of psychological edge, and by the way, the thermonuclear, if nothing else, this kind of differential in yields has an enormous psychological edge. The Chinese have it. They don't need to provoke. They don't need to start anything. They're conventionally superior to India. They're nuclear-wise very much superior to India. So why would they not be happy with the situation as is? So this is where I have argued that we really need to test again, no matter what the cost, whatever the civilian nuclear thing. And if you recall what Manmohan Singh's mantra was when he signed the 2008 nuclear deal with the United States, he said 20,000 megawatts by 2020. Recall that? There's not one single megawatt added to the electricity grid as a result of the civilian nuclear cooperation deal. So we have got no nuclear cooperation, no civilian nuclear technology, and there was a bar on the kind of nuclear technologies we would get. In other words, we hamstrung ourselves and gave away our leverage in return for nothing. And the Americans are unable to explain to many of us, certainly to me, to our satisfaction, why it is that this wouldn't hurt their cause if India was found so manifestly inferior in terms of yield, in terms of deterring China. Rather, the differential makes us end up in a situation where any government in Delhi, any sane government in Delhi, would be self-deterred. Because an incoming 3.3 megaton against our 20 kiloton promised response is ludicrous in terms of deterring anything. And that's a fact of life. So that's the reason why I always said that we now need to build up yield-wise to the Chinese levels of, megaton plus at a minimum. The other thing is, how has the situation changed since our 1998 test? Look at how the world has changed. Look at how, for instance, conventionally militarily inferior countries have held off far superior countries with their nuclear, the promise of going first use with their nuclear weapons. Well, we are, I'm in the United States right now in New York City for a holiday. I'm returning tomorrow to Delhi. Hasn't the US been deterred completely by North Korea? Because what North Korea promises to do at the first instance of a missile being detected by it coming over the horizon into North Korea is they'd take out Guam. They'd take out Tokyo in a collateral fashion. Now, Guam is a major mid-Pacific base with the United States forces. And very soon, with ICBM they have now tested, they'll now be able to take out Los Angeles instantly. They see an incoming missile on the radar and they are going to go. Given how Kim Jong-un is, he takes no nonsense. He says that I'm going to do just that. And look how they have deterred the United States. Pakistan has deterred India likewise. They said, we are going to go first use if you use your conventional superiority against us. Look at how Iran, in a sense, it is subnuclear, but everybody's afraid as to how far subnuclear it is. So you have a situation wherein the practical aspects of nuclear deterrence, they kick in. Because if you're faced with conventional military annihilation, then obviously you'll have no compunction in going weapons nuclear, meaning using your nuclear weapons, what you have, to at least get back, a little to what you're going to suffer or what you've already suffered in the situation. And therefore and this is where I'll in the next 10, 12, 20, 15 minutes, I've talked about why we need to modify our nuclear doctrine. To first use, we have to, I've argued, have a two-tier nuclear doctrine. One meant for smaller nuclear states like Pakistan, and one that has to deal solely with China. And what I've therefore said is that in the two-tier nuclear doctrine, vis-a-vis Pakistan, we stay with the credible minimum deterrence notion, meaning we'll retaliate only. Retaliation only response. That the Pakistanis, if they want to go nuclear, they'll have to initiate nuclear attack before we respond. And the reason that is not going to work for Pakistan is, as I have in my numerous visits to Pakistan, and including talks to their military, have said that the exchange ratio doesn't work for Pakistan, for a smaller country. Why? Because in all the gaming that's been done all over the world, in UK, in the US, and in India, at the National Security Council level, the games, nuclear games played, the tripwire games played, you have a situation where the results are the same. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan will become extinct as a social organism in the Spenglerian sense. As a social organism, it will become extinct. In return, what India will suffer are the loss of two metro cities. They are likely to be Delhi and Bombay. Let's be very clear about it. In which case, I bring this up with my Pakistani friends. I tell them, isn't it ironic that you are going to target Delhi and Bombay, the two concentrations of the largest concentrations of Indian Muslims in India, in the larger metro Mumbai region and the larger Delhi metropolitan region. So that's the irony that the Pakistanis have to, of course, deal with. Their strategic plans division in Chaklala have to deal with, but they're not idiots. One of the things I've realized is the professionalism of the Pakistan Army. They understand what the exchange ratio is, how extraordinarily uh, disproportionate it is as far as the losses they'll suffer. They lose their country. And as everybody says, Pakistan Army is an army that has a state. They lose the state that they preside over, that they run. In essence, whatever the democratic sheen they have, the fact of the matter is the Pakistan Army runs that country and is looked after very well by the society and the state. They have the first call on the defense budget, etc. So they will not initiate anything, no matter what they say. However, there's one little thing, one little scenario that I put forward to the Pakistanis as to what might inadvertently happen if if you attack Indian armored columns within Pakistan, the most likely Pakistani used scenario. Indian armor elements get into Pakistan is when they are nuclear bombarded in that situation by the Pakistani nuclear forces. Then I said, look what might happen. The radioactivity cloud, there'll be debris, there'll be radioactive debris which will seed clouds. In the campaign seasons in the subcontinent, you have, which is in the winter, the winds are blowing west to east. These are practical matters. We have to be very aware of it. And the Pakistanis have now become aware. I'd like to think also because I made them aware, and this all in my books and so on, that when the radioactive clouds move over onto the Indian side, west to east, blown by the breeze, in that season, and once they precipitate, because they will precipitate, because the heavy radioactivity will make it, heavy. The molecule of water will go around the radioactive elements and rain down on Indian cities and towns on the border. Inadvertently, then, India will have to respond strategically. Why? Because the Indian population will be hurt. It's not the armored column that you've hit, it's now the Indian population that will be struck by radioactivity. So that is something that the SPD in Chaklala, the Pakistan Army, has to be mindful of. And I'm assuming that they are now mindful of it because it could trigger a strategic response, which, as we have talked about, what the strategic response is in terms of massive kind of retaliatory threat that our doctrine formally professes, and you have a wipeout. So therefore, we need not worry. As I said, we can disregard the Pakistani threat. Pakistan has posed no military threat ever. We really have to be realist to do this and proceed on the basis that the sole threat is provided by China, which is also, unfortunately for India, also conventionally massively superior to India. And as everybody, all military analysts now say, the Chinese People's Liberation Army and its Air Force and the Navy all together now very soon will begin to rival the capabilities of the United States in every respect, not just in strategic respects in terms of nuclear forces, but in terms of conventional military. That's why the conventional military buildup that everybody is aware of. So this is the kind of stuff that India faces. And we have a border situation that the Chinese have ignited with their ingress into Ladakh and capture of 1,000 square miles of our territory in the Demchok region and in the plains, Demchok Plains region of Ladakh, which abuts curiously on the Xinjiang highway that connects Lhasa to Urumqi. So that's the lifeline that the Chinese cannot lose. But that's also the reason for trying to take a buffer zone, which is really something that they grabbed from Indian territory. Sorry. So if that is the situation we are now facing, and we have built up our forces to negate any kind of advances the PLA might make in Aksai Chin, and as the army chief very recently said, we are ready and we are prioritizing ammo stock build up, the beefing up of our presence, reserves in the 14th sector Leh area, etc. Now, all that is fine. But my point is, the Chinese still we have enormous, our infrastructure is building up very fast, but we still cannot match anything that the Chinese have built up over the years in Tibet. So while Indian forces have to climb up to 14,000 level to Leh, or 12,000 level to Leh, and then go up again, the Chinese who are already ensconced on the Tibetan plateau merely have to motor down to the border. I mean, they just tootle down to the border in the lorries, get down, take up positions, or place their howitzers, their mountain long-range artillery, while we have to trundle all these things up from the plains. So the threat that is ensconced and entrenched on an upland is always at an advantage militarily compared to the country that has to come up to fight. That is obvious. These are basic things. So we are therefore at a conventional military disadvantage of a very serious kind. How do you rectify the situation? I have said the first thing we need to do, as I said in the two-tiered thing, let's keep the no first use and the minimum doctrine, whatever it is, with Pakistan, which, as I've always said, is more a nuisance than a threat, and then tackle China solely. We have to discard vis-a-vis China the no first use. What does that mean? If all we have is a 20 kiloton, and we now have something, the area weapons like Prahar and so on, which are nuclearized, and we have the ballistic missiles for point targets, value targets, and Agni 5, by the way, is perhaps incredibly accurate missile at range, at extreme range. It has very great accuracy. Of course, we're not going to discuss what the accuracy is. That's what the Chinese have to worry about. But suffice to say that these can be fired from hinterland points. But we have the Agni 1, 700 kilometers, medium range ballistic missile. We have Prithvi's short range ballistic missiles. We have, as I said, Prahar and other area weapons that are forward deployed. Once we match up this kind of short range and medium range weapons deployment with the no first use, guess what happens? You are setting up a tripwire that the Chinese will have to trip for us to go nuclear. In other words, we are very much in this particular change that I'm suggesting, that I've been advocating, is very much in line with the government of India's thinking, which is passive, defensive, reactive, meaning that the Chinese PLA will have to come through through the Himalayan passes for the the activation of Indian arms deployed there, short range and medium range weapons deployed there. The additional things that I've been propounding from the very time I was in the National Security Advisory Board are atomic demolition munitions. What are atomic demolition munitions? These are very simple weapons that can be, that are suitcase size virtually, that you can place in a hillside or mountainside. And once the, say, a group army passes through, a Chinese group army passes through, you bring down the mountainsides on the passing group army. What does that do? It is unique. Once you bring down the mountainside, there is no the venting of radioactivity, because dirt, earth is the best absorber of gamma rays, and therefore there is no radioactivity. So that provocation of radioactivity, which is the reason why most countries are self-deterred from using nuclear weapons, or have been so far, is now available to India. You bring down mountainsides on the passing Chinese armies who have already ingressed into India across the line of actual control, giving us every reason and casus belli in international laws of war for us to go nuclear, because we are reacting to the Chinese action. We are not initiating action. And this has to be made clear and public to the world at large, and particularly to Beijing. That's your call. It's your call for us to go nuclear. If you ingress into Indian territory, we'll feel free then, conforming to international law of war, to respond as we see fit. And because we are conventionally militarily inferior to you guys, we are going to now go nuclear, first with atomic demolition munitions. If you somehow get past that, we are then going to begin using our short and medium range missiles against you. And just to end on one last note, to keep to my time frame, Dr. Adityanjee, the largest concentration of missiles, Chinese missiles, out on mainland China and Tibet, is in Tibet. Second largest. The largest is on the Fujian coast, fronting on Taiwan. The Qumai and Matsu, the straits, Taiwan Straits. The largest Chinese concentration. The second largest is in Tibet. So again, we have to have the first use, and it has to be made clear to the Chinese that because there's no technology in the world that can distinguish a warhead in flight, whether it's nuclear or conventional, and therefore any missile that is fired from the Tibetan plateau coming southwards will be assumed to be nuclear, and we will go for, we will respond accordingly. That too has to be made clear, which is again reactive, meaning anytime you fire a missile, because there's no technology in the world that can detect a nuclear warhead from a conventional warhead, we will assume it's nuclear and will respond with nuclear weapons. And that, in short, is the kind of modification I seek, which I think is very reasonable, is something that Indian government should make, because as far as I can see, no matter how we game it, Chinese have an enormous edge. It's not just an edge, it's so massive. We are really not in the same game, really, honestly and realistically speaking. And this is therefore how we need to respond. Otherwise, we can sit back and let China do whatever it wants, and violate our territory, our sovereignty at will. That we cannot allow to happen. And that's why I have been advocating this change in our nuclear doctrine, in our posture, in our policy, and our strategy. And I think it'll do the country well if we implement it. Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee. I think I've taken up my 40 minutes, a little bit more. I'm sorry for that.
That's perfectly fine, Professor Karnad. Before I take questions from the chat, I have a couple of questions. There are actually only two countries that have no first use doctrines, and they are essentially India and China. China, over a period, has revised and modified and metamorphosed its no first use doctrine. And one of the stipulations is that NFU does not apply if Chinese territory is in adverse possession. While they claim Arunachal Pradesh as southern Tibet, technically sitting today, Chinese could use a tactical weapon in Arunachal Pradesh and still say, without batting an eyelid, that we never violated our NFU doctrine. Any comments?
Well, yes, but this is the sort of thing wherein you get into all manner of historical kind of baggage that we all have to carry. China claims an awful lot of Nepal, for instance, or Bhutan, for instance, a lot of the higher, the Aksai Chin, all of it, for instance, which really, of course, they did not sign the 1913 Simla Agreement with the McMahon Line. It's true, they did not sign it. But the fact of the matter is, it's become a customary thing because they did not thereafter object to it either. In fact, Zhou Enlai, when he first met Nehru in 1953, offered to exchange, if you recall, going back into history, he said, we'll give you Arunachal Pradesh in return for your accepting our idea of our border in Aksai Chin, which, by the way, what they've already captured. Their idea of Aksai Chin, which they claim as their territory, is what they already almost all but captured. So for them to say, well, yeah, what Zhou Enlai said was, but that is the stated Chinese position from those times. And history cannot just be easily disregarded just to serve your purpose. The fact of the matter is, yes, they claim so many things. Claims do not, in a sense, substantiate your historical position in terms of reality. They don't change reality. Arunachal Pradesh, what was called the Northeast Frontier Province in British times, and we kept that, it was so called Northeast Frontier Agency is what we called it in those days. That's now been changed to the Arunachal Pradesh and so on, other states that we have carved out of the NEFA. And the entire NEFA was a British Indian territory. And so you cannot use history then in this reactionary way to claim something that was way past. They go back into Tibet, 5th century, and so on and so forth, to claim that, well, the Tibetan Lamasari state extended to Arunachal Pradesh. That's their claim. Now, the point is, whatever they claim, the claim has to have some objective reality, and that I don't think it meets in terms of recent history. And by recent, I mean all of 19th century, all of 20th century. That's history. If they keep going back to Tang dynasty of the 4th century BC and so on, then we can go back, to even further to say we spread Buddhism, and Buddhist emperors adopted Buddhism, and therefore we have a lien on the Chinese territory, that China is actually a colony of India. We can do that, can't we? You can stretch any kind of argument. True, it is that in real terms that Arunachal Pradesh in recent times is what they claim, but these are claims and counterclaims that all countries can make.
So the second question is that you have advocated a two-tier no first use doctrine. Why stick to a no first use doctrine? And at some point in time, I've suggested that we replace NFU doctrine with a sole purpose doctrine for India. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, the two-tier is really because to differentiate China from the Pakistan threat. Pakistan, because Pakistan poses no threat and has never posed a threat to India. It has been one of the, shall we say, misorientations of Indian foreign policy, foreign and military policy, that has got India into this hole that we are in. We have, for 70 years, we have expended monies, public monies, on a force, in building up a force that is relevant only to the Western sector, the lesser threat, the puny threat, while leaving virtually the entire main threat frontage open to China to violate. And that has been our wrong. We are wrong to have done that. We were completely, I think, foolish to disregard the China threat, starting from Nehru's days when the China, Chini, Hindi, Bhai, Bhai, and all that nonsense. Because in real terms, in realpolitik terms, no regime has been more realist than the Chinese regime in the history of the world. And if we don't take lessons from how China has always behaved, the unerring, they have never wavered, they have never erred in claiming less territory than they have claimed. This is the incredible thing. They'll hark back to this, that, and the other, some dynasty or the other, from the China of the feuding kings and whatnot. Uh, but the point of the matter is, they are stuck to the notion that this, that, and the other belongs to China. By that reckoning, the five fingers, as the Chinese see it, Tibet, Sikkim, um, Nepal, Bhutan,
And
and
Ladakh.
and
And
Aksai Chin.
Ladakh.
And Aksai Chin. By the way, Arunachal Pradesh is already there. It's already part of the southern Tibet. So Aksai Chin is what they claim as the five fingers that they should have, which now includes four sovereign countries. And with Bhutan and with Nepal, they already have signed border accords, which conform to the present line of possession of the two countries, where there's no problem at all. So, this is very fungible. The notion the Chinese notion of border is very fungible. It seems to be very flexible. Depending on against India, it's very hard. It is this, it is that, it is Arunachal Pradesh, Raj. While with other countries, smaller countries, they are more flexible and they give it in. That's fine. That's the realpolitik notion, and we have to admire it. And by the same token, I think we have to acquire the notion of the realism has to get injected into our policy as to what is really the threat that India is, that India faces by way of imminent danger, both imminent and imminent danger. It is only China and China alone.
Thank you. I will start taking questions from the audience, and I am reading through the chat function. There is one question which goes back to the history by Dr. Vineet Singh. In 1977, there was some talk about Israeli forces wanting Jamnagar Air Base air refueling capabilities so as to be able to bomb Kahuta, nuclear power plant in Pakistan. The question that is being asked is, did we make a strategic blunder at that time by not doing so?
Oh, by the way, I think he must somewhere the source must have been me, because I was the one who, when I'd gone to Israel in 1982, when the war was going on, the Lebanon war was going on, and I met Major General Aaron Yariv, who was the MI chief, Moshe Dayan's MI military intelligence chief, and he's the one who who let me know about this operation that was planned for 1986. It was planned for 1986, before the Pakistanis had reached the nuclear threshold, weapon threshold. And the idea was, and this is what I then came and wrote about it in an Indian newspaper, and then subsequently in my big tome of a book, Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security, where you'll find the details of this. This is what I believe he's referring to. But until then, it was all a secret, both from the Indian side and the Israeli side. And the idea was for the Israeli Air Force to fly in the F-15s for combat air patrol, and the F-16s for actual striking. They'd come in over the Arabian Sea, avoiding seaborne radar, the Pakistani seaborne radar, fly into Jamnagar, refuel and replenish their stocks, weapon stock, and so on. But their main weapon load to bomb Kahuta, which is the nuclear complex outside of Islamabad, would be uploaded in Udhampur Air Base, Indian Air Force Base at Udhampur. And the idea was that the pilots would rest up, the Israeli pilots would rest up in Jamnagar, and then the F-15 and the F-16 complements will fly together over India, allowing everybody to track the flight, with the Israelis said that we will not repaint our planes in Indian colors or anything else. We'll fly in as Israeli aircraft flying in to take out Kahuta. And the idea was they would the very massive bomb to take out Kahuta would be loaded on F-16s, and the F-15s and F-15s will take out together. And it was a 3-minute run to Kahuta. Once you get past, the planes got past the lee of the mountains, because the lee of the mountains provide the flying aircraft with radar stealth. The Pakistani radars would not be able to pick up the incoming aircraft. And it's only when they come out on the clear is when the Pakistani radars would be able to detect them. And with the Israeli combat air patrol flying alongside the attacking aircraft, they would take care of any Pakistani aircraft that would come up to interdict or intercept, while the F-16, the Israeli F-16s would go on in rows and bomb Kahuta, each dropping the load. And mind you, in 1982, they'd done just that with the Osirak reactor, the Iraqi reactor that they bombed. So they were experts at it. The same squadrons were coming in, and everything was okayed. The Israeli pilots had come into Jamnagar, and Indira Gandhi at the last minute got the heebie-jeebies. Someone, she got it. She cancelled the deal. And it was the greatest blunder that we made, because I think we keep squawking about the Pakistani danger, which is no danger, but even the small little danger would have been taken care of had we proceeded with this, the thing. In the Israelis were, by the way, let me tell you, and subsequently I've been to Israel and so on, very upset about it, because they thought that they were doing India's job for them, and then they were, they sort of, the whole thing was turned off at the last moment. So there was a lot of angst at that end.
So the next question is from Dr. Vasishtha, who wants to know from you, in the current geopolitical scenario, what is the role for universal nuclear disarmament?
Nil. There's no role for nuclear disarmament. I mean, people who wish for this kind of nonsense, nuclear disarmed world, are living in another universe altogether. What reality are we living in when we talk about disarming the world? Well, it's true. They'd certainly, the nuclear weapon states would certainly like to see the rest of the world disarmed. Isn't that the case? I mean, that's the case that I remember K.C. Pant making, the Indian Defense Minister, the late K.C. Pant. He said all the disarmament schemes that America and everybody else floats, the British and the French and the Russians float, are to disarm the unarmed. So, there's no disarmament. There will be no disarmament. If the nuclear weapons are ever given up by the world and the countries that possess them, the most advanced countries of the world, it'll be only replaced by a more deadly, more lethal weapon and technology that may be coming. Who knows? Comics have talked about laser, death rays and whatnot. Who's to say that that won't happen? So, short of that, you're not going to have nuclear weapons banned or barred. And short of that, nobody is going to give up nuclear weapons, those who have it.
Next question is from Mr. Ripudaman Pachori from CSA. He paraphrases you that not a single nuclear power plant was being installed after the civil nuclear deal of 2009, but 17 out of 22 nuclear reactors were agreed to be used for civilian only use. What's happening to the other remaining reactors? What is their role at this point in time?
Well, the point was Homi Bhabha, as you recall, the great visionary and brilliant physicist who commanded and controlled the Indian nuclear program from the initial days. He had in 1955, he conceived of the three-stage plan for making India energy self-sufficient. And the reason was that India has the largest reserves of thorium in the world. The largest reserves of thorium in the world, and they can be scooped up from the sands on the Coromandel coast. You can scoop it up, and that's thorium. Nature has been very bountiful, and Dr. Bhabha recognized that we need to use it, and the way to get to that stage of thorium reactors was to get through the first and second stages which was the first stage, was a natural uranium reactor. And these are all interlocked stages. The first stage was natural uranium reactors, the so-called CANDU reactors that we have, which would create the feedstock for the breeder reactors, who would breed, by the very nature of the name suggests that they breed more fissile material than they consume. And that becomes a feedstock for the thorium reactor. It was a beautiful intellect plan, which I'm afraid we haven't quite realized. We are, not invested enough monies in doing that and so on. But the first stage, uniquely from Bhabha's perspective, was they also provided weapons material to make bombs. So Bhabha was no airy-fairy visionary. He had in nuclear weapons absolutely in mind, as did Jawaharlal Nehru. We may call him woolly-headed. He was where China was concerned. He did not see things right in many respects. But where nuclear weapons were concerned, he was a classical statesman. He understood the utility of power in international relations. And he said, by way of science and technology, that we need to be at the cutting edge of science and technology to have nuclear weapons so that we will not be kicked around by anybody. And very, very interestingly, and I bring this out in that book that I mentioned, Nuclear Weapons, Indian Security, he thought that India should not miss on the nuclear age as we missed out on the industrial age and the age of the gunpowder, as he put it. Very interesting. He said we missed out on the gunpowder revolution. We do not want to miss out on the nuclear revolution. So he was very far-seeing and quite a remarkable leader in that sense, considering his reputation as a peace-spouting politician and so on, which really did not quite define him.
Before I take other questions, there's a very interesting comment from one of our guests, and I'm going to read it, and then probably I'll invite that guest to say what he means by this. And this is from Dr. William Burns. This 3-minute run sounds a bit like Top Gun's Maverick, to me anyway, maybe the inspiration. Mr. Burns, do you want to come on the camera and ask directly Professor Bharat Karnad what you want to say?
Oh, sure. I turned on my mute. I'm not sure where the camera is, but no, I was just, as you were talking about going over the mountains, it's only a 3-minute run. It sounded like a bit in Top Gun Maverick where they ran through there and, they were doing the timing thing. I saw the movie like probably 3 times. So anyway, I thought maybe that's the inspiration for that, something that had happened that I didn't know about till today. Thank you.
Ambassador Burns, thank you for coming on board. No, I think this particular report was given me by Major General Aharon Yarif. I imagine he knew what he was talking about, and he was very upset that the Indian government sort of wound up that particular operation before it bore fruit. But the fact is that this was something that was offered and had been implemented until Indira Gandhi got cold feet and the whole thing was, stopped. But the 3-minute run is Major General Aharon Yarif's, and it predated, I imagine, the Maverick movie that you're referring to, which I too have watched with considerable interest.
Well, I'll just say one more thing really quickly, if I could. That, when I saw that movie, I've seen it a couple of times. And of course, I'll think of this incident now every time I see the movie. But I looked up the number of F-14s, and it turns out that Iran is the only country in the world that still flies the F-14. And so, I'm just trying to tie the, connecting the dots, sort of. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador Burns. Next question I'm going to take is from one of our guests from India, Professor Reshmi Kazi, who is professor at Nelson Mandela Peace Center with Jamia Millia. And the question is, has the Balakot strikes in any manner impacted upon India's nuclear posture and strategy?
I don't think so, Dr. Kazi. I mean, the point is, even the Balakot thing, I remember meeting Air Chief Marshal who was it? I'm sorry, one of my senior moments. Forgive me, that name doesn't, but I met him. And my whole point about the Balakot strike was that it did not work out. My reading of that is that if you're going to send a message to Pakistan, which was the message that if you're going to use terrorists to strike Indian targets and to kill Indians, then we are going to get back at you with all our might, then it was a wrong use of means. If you want to send a message to Pakistan, what the Indian Air Force should have done was sent in a massive bombing sortie to level the entire hillside, take out the mountaintop. Instead of using the precision guided munitions that we used to just go through a roof and kill somebody. That's what India claims to have done. Now, there are satellite images that suggest that virtually no damage was done. So for the Indian government to keep claiming that the Balakot attack was a great success is, to me, completely perplexing, because you had real-time imagery that suggested that there was some, as the Pakistanis themselves, they made a thing out of it, that you uprooted some trees and you killed some birds, but you did nothing else. And even assuming you had the precision strike to kill the Spice 2 weapon that was used, PGM, the Israeli Spice 2 weapon that was for that particular hit, even assuming you killed a few militants, what was the point? If you killed a few militants, that we do almost every day in Kashmir, our forces do that. If you wanted to send a message, a political message, then the idea was to go in force with such a large force, and you level the entire, the training site on the Balakot hill, just level the whole damn hillside with 500-pound bombs, and then go back and dare the Pakistanis to come after. What was it? Because the message had to get through. The message that went through is, these guys do have no guts. I'm sorry, but if you read the Pakistani thing, they were what? You send in a little thing in precision guided, and then you run back. Even as our F-16s were coming up for combat. So this is what is the message you sent? It merely, in a sense, reinforced the Pakistani view of Indians and India and the Indian government and the Indian military, that it has no stomach for a fight, which is the wrong message to send. And I remember saying that to the Air Chief Marshal, the Indian Air Force Chief, after the fact. And well, I don't think he was able adequately to respond to my skepticism.
So the next question I'm taking is from Prasanna Iyer. You've already talked about nuclear asymmetry between China and India, and he's asking you to further comment that it is projected that Chinese nuclear stockpile will become 1,500 nuclear warheads in 10 years' time, with India trailing far behind. Do you want to comment on anything on that?
Yes, absolutely. We are falling far behind. We are behind even Pakistan, by the way, by 5 nuclear weapons. The latest Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the nuclear notebook thing they carry for the Indian nuclear forces, they said we had 160 nuclear weapons warheads. Pakistan had 165. The Chinese are 1,000 odd by 2030. They're going to have it, or 10,000 or something. I mean, some ridiculously big figure. And I've always been saying that the Chinese rhetoric of, minimum deterrence is, in some sense, relative, exactly comports with our own credible nuclear deterrence as we saw it, the drafters saw it, which is a credible minimum deterrence, credible vis-a-vis what threat? Minimum, compared to what danger, what enemy? That's how it is. It's very elastic, except the government of India has not invested in our nuclear forces, and that's where the nuclear deal comes in. 13 of the reactors that was run on the CANDU reactors that run on natural uranium fuel have gotten into the IAEA net, have been pushed into the IAEA net, which means less fissile material for us to reprocess to weapon grade. So again, our government, unfortunately, is not strategic minded. which is my pet peeve, which I've been struggling with, which I've been advocating for nearly 3 decades now, and and I'm hugely frustrated that our government doesn't see the light of the day, as it were, and somehow tends to interpret even the most malign situations as they unfold in a benign fashion. We see even the worst things through a benign filter. And I'm afraid that's going to hurt India. And certainly against China, it'll really be very detrimental.
I'm going to ask a supplementary question that was asked by Mr. Ripudaman Pachori. Did the 2009 civil nuclear deal that Manmohan Singh government signed with the United States, the 123, civil nuclear agreement, did it push down India's strategic growth by many years?
Oh, absolutely. This is the reason. This is the by the way, the kind of campaign we launched. There are four of us who launched that campaign. Three others were nuclear stalwarts. Dr. P.K. Iyengar, the late Dr. Iyengar, who was chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Dr. A.N. Prasad, who was the first man who initiated the reprocessing of plutonium for weapon grade. And then retired as director of Bhabha Atomic Research Center at Bombay, and Dr. A. Gopal Krishnan, who was president and CEO of the Atomic Regulatory Commission. And we were the four people writing at the time to derail the deal. And we almost succeeded, almost, because Sonia Gandhi, who was really the aminance grace running the coalition government, not Manmohan Singh, saw what we had said, and it had gathered a lot of steam. A lot of people are saying yes, we shouldn't start, and because of our public campaign through op-eds and so on, all of which, by the way, are collated in a book called Strategic Sellout that Dr. Adityanjee mentioned at the very beginning. If whoever's interested may see just how right we were, how prophetic we were in saying that our strategic forces would be hugely hurt. In military terms, that's the case I was making, where the other nuclear stalwarts were making the case from the nuclear end, technical end. And we were very right. And so, we have been hugely hurt because the reactors, CANDU reactors that could have produced weapons grade plutonium have now been pushed into, as I said a little earlier, into the IAEA net, which is now bound by IAEA rules, and we cannot use it for weapons purposes. So it's to our detriment, to our national interest, detriment of the national interest, that the nuclear deal is. While we may say, well, we still have theory, when you say that to Jaishankar, by the way, who is a foreign minister now, and was the Joint Secretary Americas who negotiated the deal, when I say to him that you negotiated the deal without realizing, being strategic minded enough to realize what was the end point, that it was to curtail our nuclear production, weapons production. But maybe he got a different policy brief from the government at the time. God knows what. Manmohan Singh was an economist. He wanted this, that, and the other, and he had no strategic mind to speak of. And I can vouch for it. I met him, and he didn't understand. I took Dr. Iyengar to meet with him to explain when he was the leader of the opposition in Rajya Sabha. And this was after the 1998 voluntary moratorium, where we were trying to advocate more testing. So Dr. Manmohan Singh didn't seem to understand, have a clue about anything. So I therefore can extrapolate and say that he did not think strategically when he was contemplating this nuclear deal with America, because we have got nothing in return while we have surrendered so much.
There are a couple of questions in the chat function from Mr. Ankush Bhandari, but I'm not going to ask that question. I will paraphrase that question. But in your mind, what is India's path to join nuclear supplier group?
Well, the nuclear suppliers group, I'm not sure why it is that we are joining the nuclear suppliers group. I oppose joining the nuclear suppliers group. Why are we club joiners? You are a revisionist power. We are not happy with the status quo. But we seem to be happy with the status quo, even when we say we are not. Nuclear suppliers group puts more controls, puts more constraints on us on who to sell to, what to sell to, what countries we will need to sell to. When actually this is nuclear technology that we created, developed ourselves completely. It's entirely, fully indigenous. Why are we putting constraints on how we use our technology, how we sell our technology to whoever we want to sell to, for whatever purpose they want to buy it for? How come all the major countries have proliferated, including America, by the way? Let's be very clear about it. They proliferated to France, they proliferated to Israel, right? China has proliferated to Pakistan, to North Korea. And in the latter two, I called it the rogue triad of China, Pakistan, North Korea. How come India is so abstemious and doesn't have the guts and gumption to respond in kind? Do as what America and other countries do. Don't do as what they say. If proliferation is good for everybody, let it be good for everybody. Don't spout non-proliferation to us while you proliferate and look after your interests. This is the simple case I've been making, that do as they do, not do as they say.
Incidentally, for Ankush Bhandari, Nuclear Supplier Group was started in 1975 after 1974 peaceful Pokhran 1 explosion. It was specifically created as an anti-India sanctions mechanism.
Correct.
So people tend to forget that history, and I will share
And
that.
may I just add, with your permission, Dr. Adityanjee, the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 was entirely drafted, configured to keep India non-nuclear. By the way, not just a nuclear suppliers group, that came later. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was entirely anti-India because we were on the cusp starting in 1964 when we began reprocessing plutonium. And I've been told recently, when I asked them practically, did we have the weapons grade and how much did we have to actually have weapons? He said, well, yeah, if we had it been put on a war footing, as Bhabha had requested Nehru, in 62, mind you, this is really ironic. While we were getting beaten in the Himalayas, Indian army was being humiliated by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Bhabha went to Nehru and said, let me test. It'll lift up a morale. I'm using Bhabha's word, it'll lift the morale of the Indian people who feel humiliated and defeated, demoralized. And Nehru said, no, this is where, again, he was such a great man in nursing and nurturing the nuclear program, the dual purpose, dual role nuclear program, which, by the way, he called Janus faced. Janus is the Greek god looking in the opposite directions. This is how he used to communicate to those who needed to know. Janus faced was nuclear civilian and nuclear military. And yet, when it came to the crunch, he did not allow Bhabha. This is the tragedy of our political leadership, that we don't act on once we have the capability, we don't go ahead and act. We just talk and the ponder, and we don't really go ahead and do things. And that's been our failing, I'm afraid.
So, using my moderator's prerogative, since you did mention Dr. Homi Bhabha, do you think he was taken out on Swiss Alps by the deep state of United States, as is usually alleged,
No,
to prevent India from
by the
crossing
way,
us?
it's not usually alleged. The CIA agent who put the limpet mine in the cargo hold of the Air India flight going into Geneva, and which crashed with the thing blown up near Mont Blanc, was a CIA agent chap called Crowe, Crowe. And he put it up on the net. For God's sake, there's a book wherein he has professed to putting that limpet mine or whatever it is, bomb in the cargo hold of that flight in Mumbai. It was and if you read what Crowe says about Bhabha, he said, oh, these people, these uppity Indians, they want to have a bomb. This is how they saw us. And they had to get rid of him. They got rid of him. But this only points to how hard-headed you need to be in this world. You cannot be pussyfooting around, universal values, disarmament, and this, that, and nice things, and peace and harmony, and all nonsense. Go ahead, have a hard thing, and use the goddamn stick, and you'll get respect. You won't get respect by, spouting peaceful nonsense and this, that, and the other that our government, unfortunately, does. Perhaps less now than in the past, but it does.
There is a question from Kyle William Marston, who refers to a Al Jazeera article about lack of insurance coverage for India's civil nuclear program and the level of expansion plan for it. What he's alluding it that while a large percentage of Indian population goes without electricity, providing some sort of insurance cover would mitigate the energy needs. Any comments?
Yeah, the point is, look, Bhabha was never, as the originator of the energy, energy self-sufficiency plan, the three-stage plan that I talked earlier about. He was never under any impression or deluded in believing that the unit cost for nuclear electricity is going to be much, much higher than coal or hydro power. So the cost was the real factor here. Why have we not had more nuclear civilian plants? Because it costs a lot of money. And India has, until now, been very short of money and resources. So it has had to decide, where do you want to invest in? Now that we have the money, we are a lot richer than we were at one time. I've been saying that we have to also use our military expenditure for our military nuclear weapons program and not go into starving the civilian nuclear energy program, which is a different theme. But this is how we begin to make it affordable, meaning people get the electricity and the country gets its weapons for security. Both are available. Both can be done. It's not one at the expense of the other, as has been argued. Even, it's an argument that the Indian government has bought from the West. And again, as I said, this has been at our expense, at India's expense.
There is some talk in the chat function, some private messages about United States government condoning Pakistan's nuclear program. And there was a book called Deception, Pakistan, the United States and the Secret Trades in Nuclear Weapons by Adrian Levy and Catherine Scott Clark. You want to elaborate on that sad chapter on United States culpability in, winking clearly at China-Pakistan collaboration in delivering the Pakistani bomb?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the Deng Xiaoping virtually sought permission from George W. Bush when he had come to Washington to pass on nuclear weapons design, materials, expertise to Pakistan. By the way, just so we know, which is going to be made clear in my next book that I'm writing, which will make this clear. So, the the American complicity is what I have mentioned time and again in my books. They were very, very much there. America was still then thinking of balancing in the subcontinent as to how they would militarily or otherwise balance a small, wretched little country like Pakistan with India. I have no idea. That again suggests the strategic mindset of the Washington elite. But I cannot for the life of me fathom how that could be done. But they believed it and they did it. They said to China, yes, go ahead. Remember what Kissinger said by way of in 71 war. He was pleading for China to open a front against India. Henry Kissinger. And I've been saying, why is this man being lionized in India, in Delhi? This is the guy who said, he was, literally prodding Mao Zedong to start an affray on the Himalayan side of the watershed so that the Pakistan would get a respite in East Bengal. or East Pakistan. So this is the background. And it's the same Kissinger who I quote in my book saying, Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security, saying that when he was asked, well, what if India had weaponized after 1974, as we should have done, as I've argued, as we should have done, we should have gone full, thing ahead, full steam ahead, and weaponized fully before agreeing to any kind of limits, not agreeing at all, considering the development of the Chinese weapons and arsenal. He said, well, had they done it in 74, what could we have done? We'd have had to accept it. This is the point I've been making. No country can stop you if you're not willing to be stopped. But if you have people who confuse disarmament and non-proliferation with India being a responsible state, God knows what kind of idiocy that they believe in, then you get the mess that we are in.
And those are the very wise words from Professor Bharat Karnad. I must say that I am always fascinated by your writings, your interviews, your books. It was absolutely pleasure. I think you are a true son of India who has strategic clarity in an age which involves actually fuzziness of mind as the true characteristic of national political leadership and establishment. I am very delighted that you chose to come on our platform. I will hope that you will continue to come on our platform for various events. I am thankful to you for that. I'm thankful to all our guests who were able to devote 1.5 years on a Saturday morning of their weekend on this somewhat esoteric subject that does not fascinate very many people. And lastly, I would like to thank my team CSA, Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, Mr. Rajiv Verma, and Mr. Ankush Bhandari, who helped me, organize these events for strategic discourse and education in international relations. Again, we are very pleased to have you as a distinguished guest, distinguished speaker, and we hope that you will continue to grace our platform in future as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanjee, and good wishes to the Council for Strategic Affairs. Thank you.
And with that, we will close the meeting.